Smoke that blanketed North American cities.
Peninsula as a massive
when a natural disaster crossing an
The U.S. was being unnecessary.
Fires that they were already fighting
are living under a thick orange haze of wildfire smoke that has drifted south from Canada, pushing air quality in several major American cities into hazardous territory. And into that already difficult moment, President Donald Trump has added a political charge. He is publicly blaming Canada for the smoke and floating the idea of new tariffs as compensation. So the question I want to explore with you today is straightforward but consequential. What happens when a natural disaster crossing an international border becomes the newest front in an already tense relationship between Washington and Ottawa? Let me start with what is happening on the ground, because the human reality comes first. In cities including Detroit, Chicago, and Washington, D.C., residents woke up to skies dimmed by particle pollution. At one point during the day, an independent air quality monitoring service ranked those 3 American cities among the most polluted on the entire planet. That is a striking measurement for major population centers in North America, and it explains why the warnings have been so urgent. In the nation's capital, the haze grew thick enough that landmarks normally visible across the Potomac River, including the Washington Monument and the Capitol, were difficult to make out through the smoke. The National Weather Service has been advising people to limit their time outdoors and to keep windows closed overnight to reduce exposure. Some state and local authorities have gone further, cautioning that even healthy adults, not only vulnerable groups, could feel the effects of air this poor. That is an important distinction. Public health advisories usually focus first on children, older adults, and people with respiratory or heart conditions. When officials extend the warning to healthy adults as well, it signals that the concentration of fine particles in the air has reached a level worth taking seriously. Regional authorities have offered practical guidance for anyone who cannot avoid being outside. In the Washington area,
was the charged smoking ground.
Super long days, lots of hard work that's been put in.
Those communities among more than a dozen under threat with
a council of local governments urged residents not to spend extended time in these conditions. And for those who must work outdoors, health experts have pointed to N95 filtration masks, the same type widely used during the pandemic, as an effective barrier against fine smoke particles. There is one detail worth emphasizing here because it matters for safety. A simple cloth mask does not provide meaningful protection against wildfire smoke.
Certainly, as you said, does not respect borders.
All right, Matthew, we'll leave it there, but really great to get that update and also that explanation of what is happening. Matthew Capucci, senior...
The particles are too small, so if you are in one of the affected regions and you need to be outdoors, the type of mask genuinely makes a difference. Now, there is some encouraging news in the forecast, and I want to share it before we move deeper into the politics. Most forecasts point to a line of thunderstorms moving through the affected region, with rain expected to help clear the air and disperse many of these particles. Meteorologists suggested the worst of it could ease within roughly a day, offering relief to communities that have been under the haze. That timing also carries a bit of significance beyond public health. The World Cup final is scheduled to be played in New Jersey on Sunday afternoon, and there had been real questions about whether the smoke would affect players and fans. Forecasters indicated that expected rainfall over that area heading into the weekend should improve conditions in time for the match, though as with all weather, that outcome depends on the storms actually arriving as predicted. That brings us to the part of the story that has turned a weather event into an international dispute. President Trump addressed the smoke directly through a post on his social media platform, and his framing was pointed. He described the United States as being, in his words, unnecessarily invaded by filthy, polluted, and unhealthy air. He argued that Canada is not properly maintaining its forests, characterized that as willful negligence, and claimed it is costing the United States billions of dollars. Then he closed with the suggestion that has drawn the most attention: that Canada should compensate the United States, and that the mechanism for doing so should be tariffs. I want to be precise about what this is and what it is not. At this stage, this is a statement of position and a proposal, not an enacted policy. No new tariff tied specifically to wildfire smoke has been formally imposed as a result of this post. The president has raised the idea publicly and connected it to a grievance, but turning that into actual trade measures would require additional steps. So as we discuss it, we should treat it as a political demand and a possible future action rather than a completed decision. That distinction matters because the difference between a social media post and a signed policy is significant for everyone who would be affected. The president is not the only voice in Washington raising the issue. There is also movement in Congress. Senator Bernie Moreno has signaled an effort to introduce measures targeting Canada over the smoke, and 4 Republican members of Congress from Michigan sent a letter to Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney urging his government to bring the situation under control. So what began as a weather event is now being taken up by elected officials on multiple fronts, which tells you how quickly a cross-border environmental problem can become a subject of legislative and diplomatic friction. To understand why this landed the way it did, we need to look at the broader relationship, because this dispute is not happening in isolation. Tensions between the United States and Canada have been elevated throughout this period, and the smoke has become one more point of contention in a wider back and forth. Consider a separate example that surfaced around the same time. Canadian officials indicated they would withhold certain toll payments related to a bridge connecting Canada to Michigan, citing money they say the United States owes. Whether or not that specific issue is directly connected to the smoke dispute, it illustrates the pattern. A series of disagreements accumulating between 2 neighbors who share the longest international border in the world and an enormous, deeply interconnected economy.
Frequency and severity of wildfires. Carney and Trump will likely run into each other on Sunday at the World Cup final in New York City.
There is also a genuine policy question buried inside the political rhetoric, and I think it deserves a clear, fair explanation. Critics in the United States have raised the issue of forest management, and this is where the 2 countries differ in a structural way. With cross-border trade, watch these disputes closely, because even the possibility of new barriers introduces risk. State governments like Michigan's sit right at the intersection. In Canada, the vast majority of forested land, more than 90% by most accounts, is owned by governments, both provincial and federal. In the United States, the ownership picture is almost reversed, with only a small share of forest land held by government and the large majority in private hands, much of it controlled by timber companies. Those private owners often practice active forest management, including thinning out dense undergrowth and conducting controlled burns designed to reduce the fuel that feeds large fires. The argument some American lawmakers are making is that Canada does not apply those same intensive management practices across its enormous northern forests, and that this contributes to the scale of the fires. That is the critique at the center of Senator Moreno's position, and it is worth engaging with seriously rather than dismissing. But I also want to place a crucial piece of context beside it, because the full picture is more complicated than a simple management failure. Much of the land that burns in Canada is remote wilderness, forests so vast that experts describe it as impractical to actively fight. One point raised in the public discussion captured the scale vividly. The area involved can be comparable to the size of the entire American South. You cannot realistically position enough personnel and fire engines to control fires across a territory that large. That is why Canadian authorities have often chosen to monitor certain wilderness fires rather than attempt to suppress every one of them. So the debate is not as simple as accusing one country of not hiring enough firefighters. It is a question of geography, resources, land ownership, and management philosophy all at once. The Canadian response has added another dimension to the story.
Some are even camping in friends' yards, so situations like the one in Uppsala really putting more pressure on that.
All right, thank you, Cheyenne. That's Cheyenne Desjardins.
When Prime Minister Mark Carney was asked about the criticism, his answer pointed in a different direction. Rather than accepting the forest management framing, he suggested the United States should make greater use of clean energy.
When they can go back to the home they think is still there.
It's nothing but a blessing from God that we still have a fighting chance.
And Cheyenne, we've been here.
That reply reframes the issue around climate rather than around firefighting tactics, and it signals that Ottawa does not intend to simply absorb the blame as presented. Some observers read his emphasis on clean energy as an implicit acknowledgement that broader environmental factors are in play, though he did not concede the specific management critique. Provincial leaders in Canada have weighed in as well, and their tone has been notably different from the sharper exchanges out of Washington. Ontario Premier Doug Ford struck a conciliatory note, describing Americans as good neighbors and suggesting that the more constructive response to the fires would be to offer help and support rather than to trade complaints. He pointed out that Canada has provided assistance to the United States in the past, framing cross-border cooperation as the natural way for the 2 countries to handle shared challenges. That is a meaningful contrast in approach, and it shows that even within this dispute, there are voices on both sides of the border emphasizing partnership over confrontation. And here is a detail that complicates the simplest version of this argument, one I think is important for a full and fair account. A Republican congresswoman from Michigan, Lisa McClain, noted that her state had actually sent firefighters and foresters to help Canada during a previous round of these wildfires. She indicated she had been in contact with the White House and with federal officials about the current situation. That fact cuts across the narrative in an interesting way. It shows that even amid the political finger-pointing, there has been real, practical cooperation between American states and Canada on the ground. Help has moved north across the border before, which suggests the relationship on this specific issue is not purely adversarial, whatever the rhetoric at the top might suggest. So let me step back and connect these threads, because I think the tension in this story is genuinely worth understanding. On one side, there is a legitimate policy conversation about how forests are managed and whether different practices could reduce the intensity of fires. Reasonable people can debate that, and it is fair for one country to raise land management concerns with a neighbor when the consequences quite literally cross the border and enter American lungs. On the other side, there is a much larger reality that no single forestry policy fully addresses. The frequency and intensity of these wildfire seasons have been increasing, and many who study the issue connect that trend to a warming climate. That is a factor no amount of firefighting or tariff policy directly resolves. To understand why this matters beyond the immediate haze, we need to look at what is really changing. This kind of smoke event, with major American cities blanketed for days, was far less common in past decades. It has become a more regular feature of summers in recent years. When a phenomenon that once felt rare starts to repeat, it stops being a single news story and becomes a recurring condition that governments, businesses, and families have to plan around. That shift is arguably the most consequential part of this whole situation, even if it receives less attention than the dramatic exchange of blame. There is also a broader economic and diplomatic issue here, and I want to lay it out clearly. The president's proposal to use tariffs as a form of compensation, if it were ever pursued, would touch one of the most significant trading relationships on Earth. The United States and Canada exchange enormous volumes of goods, energy, and services every year, and their economies are woven together across industries and supply chain, the White House, and with federal officials about the current situation. That fact cuts across the narrative in an interesting way. It shows that even amid the political finger-pointing, tariffs are essentially taxes on imported goods, and they tend to raise costs somewhere along the chain, whether for businesses, importers, or ultimately consumers. So a tariff introduced over an environmental grievance would not stay contained to that grievance. It would ripple into trade that has nothing to do with forests or smoke. That is why a proposal like this draws such immediate attention, and why it is important to distinguish, as I said earlier, between a stated idea and an actual policy. Let me turn now to who is most directly affected, because the consequences land differently depending on where you sit. For the more than 100 million people currently under the smoke, the immediate concern is health and daily life, whether to send children outside, whether to exercise, whether to keep windows shut, whether to wear a mask on the walk to work. I expect many of you are asking, is this dispute mainly about forests, or is it about the larger relationship? The honest answer, based on the available information, is that it is For people with asthma, other respiratory conditions, or heart conditions, the stakes are higher, and the advisories to stay indoors are aimed squarely at protecting them. For workers whose jobs require them to be outside, the guidance around N95 masks is not abstract. It is a practical measure they may need to take seriously in the coming days. For border communities and the businesses that operate across the frontier, the political friction carries a different weight. When leaders in Washington and Ottawa exchange sharp words, and when proposals like tariffs or withheld payments enter the conversation, the uncertainty itself can affect planning and confidence. Companies that depend on smooth cross-border trade watch these disputes closely, because even the possibility of new barriers introduces risk. State governments like Michigan's sit right at the intersection of all of this, connected to Canada by infrastructure, commerce, and, as we have seen, by mutual assistance during emergencies. That brings us to the central question I suspect many of you are asking. Is this dispute mainly about forests, or is it about the larger relationship? The honest answer, based on the available information, is that it is about both, and the two are tangled together.
Weighs the risk.
Also interesting. Thank you for this, Darius.
Thank you.
The wildfire situation in British Columbia continues to worsen tonight. The province...
There is a real and specific policy disagreement about forest management practices and land ownership. There is also a broader climate reality that shapes why these fires keep happening. And layered on top of all of it is a period of heightened political tension between the two countries, in which a natural disaster becomes another occasion for confrontation. Separating those layers is difficult, but it is essential if we want to understand what is actually driving events rather than just the loudest headline. Let me be clear about what has been confirmed and what remains unresolved, because that line matters. What is confirmed is that dense wildfire smoke from Canada has degraded air quality for a large share of the American population, that official health advisories are in effect, and that President Trump has publicly blamed Canada and raised the idea of tariffs as compensation
to the tariffs Canada is currently paying. The wildfires have put communities across Canada on...
What is confirmed is that members of Congress, including Senator Moreno and lawmakers from Michigan, are pressing the issue, and that Canadian officials, including Prime Minister Carney and Premier Ford, have responded with their own framing. What remains unresolved is whether any of the proposed measures will actually move forward. It is not yet clear whether tariffs tied to this issue will be formally pursued, what any congressional action would ultimately look like, or how the two governments will manage the dispute over coming weeks. The forecast suggests the immediate smoke may ease as storms move through, but the underlying disagreement about forest management, the separate frictions over cross-border payments, and the larger climate trend behind the fires are all questions that a passing weather system does not answer. So, what should you watch next? A few things will tell us where this is heading. Watch whether the tariff idea remains rhetoric or turns into a concrete proposal, because that distinction determines whether this becomes a genuine trade story or stays a political talking point. Protecting them. For workers whose jobs require them to be outside, the guidance around N95 masks is not abstract. It is a practical measure they may need to take seriously in the... Watch how the congressional efforts develop and whether they gain broader support or fade. Watch the tone from Ottawa and whether Canadian officials lean toward the cooperative posture voiced by Premier Ford or harden their position in response to the pressure from Washington. And watch the pattern of the fire seasons themselves, because if these smoke events continue to recur, the pressure on both governments to find a durable answer rather than a seasonal argument will only grow. What stands out to me most in this development is the timing and the way it fuses so many separate threads into a single moment. A weather event that no one on either side of the border chose has become a mirror reflecting a strained relationship, a real policy debate, and a larger environmental question that reaches far beyond any one government's control. The smoke will likely clear in the coming days. The disagreements it has surfaced are unlikely to clear as quickly. And that gap between the temporary relief in the air and the lasting tension in the politics is exactly why this story deserves our continued attention. As we close, let me bring it back to where we started. More than 100 million people are dealing with hazardous air from Canadian wildfires. President Trump has blamed Canada and raised the possibility of tariffs. Canadian leaders have pushed back with a mix of firmness and calls for cooperation. And beneath it all sits a debate about forest management and a warming climate that no single policy neatly resolves. This remains a developing situation, and the next official moves in both Washington and Ottawa will tell us a great deal about whether this becomes a genuine dispute or eases along with the haze. Thank you for watching my report on the wildfire smoke reaching the United States from Canada and President Trump's threat of tariffs in response. This is a fast-moving story with real consequences for public health and for the relationship between two close neighbors, and the next official decisions could sharpen the picture considerably. If you want to keep following the verified updates as this situation unfolds, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you do not miss the developments that come next.